You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
When we talk about flashpoints, we're not talking about a terrible one-season US TV show about time travelling. We could be talking about the DC universe, but we'll leave that maybe for a different podcast genre. But the idea of a flashpoint is something that causes some sort of change in the established order, kind of like a catalyst or a cataclysm. In fact, that's an interesting word. Keep that one in your mind. But flashpoints could happen in Sarajevo in 1914. They could happen in Czechoslovakia or Poland in 1938-39, or they could happen in the very near future. I can't predict when they're going to happen, and I can't give you a better definition than that because, well, I'm just a little bit hopeless at providing definitions for you listeners. G'day listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. We are back for our 2018 end of year season. Thanks for being so patient with the break, and also thanks for all your support behind our return episode from Pauline Shanks-Corinne that was released on the 30th of August. It's excellent to see you all back and listening. I'm glad to be in your ears. Now today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic and book that has just come out, and it's about flashpoints and what could possibly cause conflict in a particular region of the world. And my guest today to talk about it is Dr. Brendan Taylor. He's an associate professor at the Australian National University's Strategic and Defence Study Centre, my alma mater. He's specialising in great power strategic relations in the Asia Pacific and their implications for Australia. Dr. Taylor holds a PhD, which is why I keep calling him Dr. Taylor, and a master's degree from the Australian National University. He's an expert on Asia's flashpoints. There's the cue to today's topic, including the Korean Peninsula, the East and South China Sea disputes, and Taiwan. Other areas of research, interest and expertise for Dr. Taylor include Asian security architecture, such as the Shangri-La Dialogue, the East Asia Summit, as well as the US-Australia Alliance. He's authored or edited 10 books, including Sanctions as Grand Strategy for the prestigious International Institute for Strategic Studies Adelphi series. His book, Australia's American Alliance, that was co-edited with Peter Dean and Stefan Fruehling, both men whose lectures I've had to sit through, thanks fellas, has become required reading at the Pentagon. And I do know there's a fair few Australians who use it for course material. His writings have also featured in such leading journals as Survival, which is not about the zombie apocalypse, and the Washington Quarterly. Dr. Taylor is also a regular media commentator, which is why he's on this very established media platform. Brendan, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mick. Great to be here.
And it's good to be in the familiar surrounds of the SDSC once again, so it's always a welcoming visit. I do urge all the listeners out there not to storm the Headley Bull building though, because I get invited and you don't. Now, Brendan, before we start discussing the Four Flashpoints of how Asia goes to war, which is your latest book, which is sitting in my hand because I managed to get a copy from yourself actually, so thanks very much for the copy. One of the benefits of being a podcaster is you every now and then you get a free book. I'm actually keen to learn more about how you came into your line of research. You know, what motivated you to be an international relations and security scholar?
Well, it's a great question, Mick, and it's an area that I've always been interested in. I guess I was a child of the Cold War. I kind of grew up in the 1980s when I still remember kind of as a young boy lying under the bed sheets with my rosary beads, kind of praying that there wasn't going to be a nuclear war. And I think that I was kind of fascinated then looking at the manoeuvrings between Reagan and Gorbachev, and subsequently the Berlin Wall coming down. So it's an area I've always been interested in, and I think we've got a bit complacent that one of the reasons why I wrote this book is to kind of as a counter to the complacency that a major power war in our world today, and particularly in this region that we live in the Asian region, is unthinkable. So I think that was one of the main reasons that interest has always been there. I've had a lot of luck and serendipity along the way. I've been very fortunate to have been mentored by a number of the real giants in the field, people like the late Coral Bell, the late Des Ball, people like Hugh White and Paul Dibb. And so just having those great mentors and being around in the right place at the right time kind of also helped as well. So really a combination of factors.
It's excellent to find great mentors, and if there are any great mentors out there, there's a slot available for a very good-looking podcast host as a mentee. Now, we should start off pretty broadly, mainly because whilst I have a copy of your book, I received it 10 minutes ago from yourself, I'm yet to thumb through it in any detail. So this book covers today's topic, which is that great power conflict in the Asia-Pacific region and the flashpoints that could flare up. I'm going to use that term because I was going to say flash, but flashpoint flashes, of course. But these flashpoints that could flare up, can you give the listeners a quick rundown on what you mean by things such as the flashpoint zone and how Asia goes to war?
Well, it's another great question, Mick, because the term flashpoint is one that we hear very, very frequently, but it's actually not defined all that often. It's a term that actually comes from the sciences, but it's in the book I talk about a flashpoint as being an area that has the potential to erupt into sudden and violent conflict. And why I talk about the flashpoint zone in the book is that I'm not only just interested in the individual flashpoints. I think there's a tendency when scholars and commentators write about these flashpoints to look at them in isolation. What I'm really interested in is and what I think makes this book different is the interrelationships between the various flashpoints. And what I argue in the book, or one of the big arguments in the book, is that Asia is experiencing something called a crisis slide at the moment. This is an idea that I borrowed from Coral Bell. Back in the 1970s, she wrote about this idea of a crisis slide where you have a series of international crises and the pressure kind of builds and culminates and eventually pushes a region towards war. And Coral suggested that that sort of phenomenon was taking place in the period before the First World War and before the Second World War. And I argue in the book that we're seeing something very similar emerging in Asia today. It started back in about 2010 where we had a couple of crises on the Korean Peninsula that year. We've subsequently seen crises in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Again, on the Korean Peninsula last year, a fairly major crisis that I think drifted much closer to war than many people assume. And in the book, I also argue, and as perhaps we'll go on to talk a little bit further about, I see a looming crisis over Taiwan as well. So it's really the combination or the interrelationships between those individual flashpoints that I'm really interested in this book.
So a crisis slide, not as much fun as a water slide, but certainly one that everyone may be able to participate in. Now, the best thing about this book is, I've got to say, is its structure and the way you've outlined the topic. And that's not necessarily for the readers, it's actually for me, because I suppose I'm a pretty self-involved individual. It makes my question formulation really, really simple. And I think the listeners will really appreciate it for this episode. And when they do buy the book through our book depository link, listeners, make sure we get some coin, they'll find it very, very simple to read because you take the flashpoints in each stage. So flashpoint 1 is the Korean flashpoint. And I guess apart from being a great source of K-pop music, what exactly is the Korean flashpoint?
Well, it's a flashpoint that literally goes back centuries. I title this chapter of the book Asia's Crucible because it's an area of the region that the major powers, particularly the US, China, Japan and Russia, have been competing over for centuries. But when we talk about the Korean flashpoint today, I think it really goes back to that period immediately following the ending of the Second World War, when the Korean Peninsula Korea was divided into two separate countries. That then led to the Korean War, and that war that lasted from 1950 to 1953, as your listeners would be aware, was an unresolved war. And so that's one of the issues that remains with us today is that particular conflict has been suspended, but it was never really completely resolved. What's taken on also a new dimension over the past quarter century or so is that North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and also the missiles that are capable of carrying those weapons. And that's why we've seen this flashpoint really come into quite sharp relief over the last couple of years, because North Korea, if it hasn't achieved the capability already to strike the United States, is getting pretty close. So it's that nuclear dimension that I think is really bringing this Korean flashpoint to boiling point at present.
It's something that most people probably wouldn't naturally subscribe to Korea going back hundreds of years. Everyone thinks of the Korean War, but that peninsula has been a hot zone for conflict in Asia for quite a long time. And a unified Korea is actually probably more of an anathema to history, and people don't really understand that as much. When I say people, I don't mean scholars such as yourself. I mean idiots like myself. But let's roll on with Flashpoint number 2, because this is one that for me sort of caught me a little bit off guard, and had to do a little bit of research to try and make sure that I was tracking the right one. Because the South China Sea is probably the more well-known one in terms of media coverage at the moment. But the East China Sea is also a flashpoint that you mentioned. So what exactly is the issue here, and why is it a flashpoint?
Well, Mick, it's another issue that goes back over the centuries. And one of the things I really enjoyed about writing this book was actually being able to go back and read quite a bit of history about these flashpoints and where they come from. And what I've tried to do for the reader is to really distill that history down into a very crisp, accessible, hopefully entertaining journey as well. So because often with respect to my fellow historian colleagues that are listening, it's not always the most interesting of material to go through for pages and pages on end. But so I tried to distill that down, and the history behind this particular flashpoint is the centuries of struggle and tension between China and Japan. So these are two countries that don't like one another very much. They've fought major wars with millions killed on at least a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
Today, when we talk about the East China Sea flashpoint, what's really at issue is a set of disputed islands in that large body of water in the East China Sea, a set of islands that the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and that the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. And there's been a lot of tension around those islands in recent years. And while that's not the only area where a conflict could potentially spark between China and Japan, that's the zone or the part of the region where a flashpoint is most likely to be sparked.
And for anyone out there who's a budding student, the trick is always to determine which side your lecturer or tutor sits in terms of whose claim they support. Do not make the mistake of having a lecturer that supports either the Chinese or the Japanese claim and call the islands the other one. The safest bet is always to go Senkaku and Diaoyu, and that way you will be okay. So those islands, there's not much on them though, is that right?
Yeah, I mean they're basically uninhabitable. There's a few goats running around on there, a few kind of fungus and very, very little water. Certainly not enough water to sustain human habitation on those islands. So yeah, you wouldn't want to go there for your next holiday break of the dead Prussian.
So they're definitely really what we would call a symbolic power play.
Very much so. And there's a lot of symbolism behind all of these flashpoints, particularly the territorial disputes both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea that's also covered in the book. And
that brings us to the next flashpoint. And now this is one that I'm sure a lot of my listeners may feel a little bit more comfortable in understanding and discussing because it's been in the news quite a bit, particularly over the past decade, just based off my own memory. And we're talking about the China Lake, which I think is a term you used in the book. It's the South China Sea. We've seen artificial islands created there, things out of science fiction almost, in terms of power projection. Now this flashpoint though, this isn't like the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. This is a flashpoint that involves quite a number of different nations. Not all of them are major regional powers. So what exactly is the issue here, and how could this one flare up?
Well, it's certainly the most, as you allude to, Mick, the most complex of the flashpoints, and it's actually the chapter that took me the longest to write because there was a lot of history to read about, and I wanted to really try and get on top of all the different perspectives. Once again, it's about disputed rocks and shoals and islets in this large body of water, and also the resources, the oil and gas resources that lie beneath those waters. But one of the most interesting things I found in the book, and it might be a surprising finding for your listeners, is that out of the four flashpoints, even though it's the one that we hear the most about, it's actually the flashpoint that I think anyway is the least likely to combust. And one of the reasons for that is that it does take place over a very large body of water. And I was certainly influenced in my thinking by the work of John Mearsheimer, who your listeners will be familiar with, a book he wrote called The Tragedy of the Great Powers. And certainly Mearsheimer is a very hawkish figure in our field, certainly isn't someone who's known for preaching the virtues of peace or the likelihood of peace in our time. But Mearsheimer talks about this phenomenon or this dynamic called the stopping power of water, where he suggests that when tensions exist or disputes exist across large bodies of water, that there's actually more time for, even if some kind of clash does occur, for diplomats to be able to work to find a solution to that. So the strategic geography of this particular flashpoint is very different, for instance, to that of the Korean Peninsula, where the militaries are a lot more proximate, where there's a much greater chance for, if there is some kind of accidental clash or inadvertent clash or a build-up of tensions on the peninsula, for that to be sparked very, very quickly into or to escalate quickly into something larger because of that very tight and intimate strategic geography. So that's one of the reasons, amongst a number of reasons, why I think the South China Sea is actually one that we shouldn't be lying awake at night worrying about, notwithstanding the fact that it's very close to Australia, which is one of the reasons why I think we hear so much about it here.
Yeah, and I guess one of the big takeaways, listeners, for that is if you are going to get yourself involved in a flashpoint, the safer option is to go archipelagic rather than peninsular. But we'll move on to the next flashpoint, mainly because it's another one that may have escaped some of our listeners', let's just say, immediate news radar, though I remember as a high school student, it's certainly one that would always come up on the news because it's one that flares up every now and then. You get some exercises, demonstrations, naval issues always happening, and that's flashpoint number 4, the Taiwan Flashpoint. Now, you've given it a rather ominous term, the coming cataclysm. So what is the coming cataclysm, and any hint on what date it's due to arrive?
Well, Mick, you're absolutely right about this particular flashpoint. It has shown a tendency over the decades to flare up into periods of crises and then to lie dormant for several decades at a time. We saw a couple of fairly major crises on the across the Taiwan Strait back in the 1950s in the Cold War. During one of those, the United States has actually threatened to use nuclear weapons against communist China in defence of Taiwan. We then saw another crisis erupt, and this was probably the one that you remember when you were at high school in the mid-1990s, where there was another fairly serious crisis across the Taiwan Strait. If I look forward over the next decade, I would predict that we're going to see a similar crisis and perhaps even a more serious crisis erupt during that time. And the reason for that is I see quite a dangerous triangular dynamic at work across the Taiwan Strait at present. There are really 3 key parties to this flashpoint, Taiwan, China and the United States. And on Taiwan we see a population where the independence sentiment amongst that population of 23 million is growing stronger. And it's very understandable in many ways because that sentiment is particularly strong amongst the younger generation. If you look at Taiwanese under 29, for instance, 100% of them feel as though or see themselves as being exclusively Taiwanese. They don't feel any connection with the mainland in the same way that their parents or maybe their grandparents did. So I think that pro-independence sentiment is building on Taiwan. At the same time, we're seeing a decrease in China's patience with this particular flashpoint. If you look back over history, leaders such as Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping have shown a lot of patience towards this flashpoint. They've suggested that it can simply be deferred for 100 or even 1,000 years. China's current leader, Xi Jinping, hasn't displayed that same level of patience. In fact, he said very publicly and very stridently that this dispute can no longer be passed from generation to generation. And over the past year to 18 months, we have indeed seen the intensification of China's coercive tactics in relation to Taiwan, for instance, circumnavigating the island with very capable, in fact, nuclear-capable bombers on a number of occasions over the past year. Then in the United States, we're seeing a very erratic administration that seems to be rewriting the old traditional diplomatic playbook on Taiwan. Donald Trump has spoken directly to Taiwan's leaders. He was the first president-elect to do that. He signed into law a new piece of legislation called the the Taiwan Travel Act that allows, for the first time, government officials on both sides at any level to meet with their counterparts in Taiwan. And so we're seeing, I think, a US administration that's leaning in increasingly on this issue. But I think that leaning in is a sign of American weakness rather than American strength. And what I mean by that is if we look at the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait, certainly I think it's fair to say that America remains the most powerful player in this flashpoint at present. But if we look out over the next decade, in fact, even within the next 7 to 8 years, the ability of the United States to come to Taiwan's defence will diminish as a result of China's advances with its A2AD capability, its anti-area, anti-access capabilities that's developing. It's more powerful missiles and the like. And so I think that this window of 7 or 8 years, it's going to be very interesting to see what the United States does during this time, what Taiwan does during this time, and perhaps most importantly, how patient China is going to be during this time.
It's interesting because of that triangle you talk about. The military dynamic is, the Chinese capabilities. You talk about their anti-access area denial capabilities, and also the US has its own. And funnily enough, to defeat anti-access area denial capabilities, your capabilities look very similar when you go to counter it. But also you've got China's also using economic levers. I know they've done a tourism ban recently that's starting to choke up Taiwan. Quite a few airlines and businesses are starting to go out of business in Taiwan. It seems like Taiwan's a key player in this challenge, but it's almost at risk of being something that we saw a lot of in the Cold War as being a proxy for a struggle between two great powers.
Yes. No, absolutely, and I think that's one of the real dangers for Taiwan. And on the one hand, Taiwan is very like Australia in a lot of ways. It has a very strong interest in keeping a close relationship with the United States and keeping the United States engaged in the region. But I think there'll also be some concern on Taiwan about the prospect of getting dragged into this larger competition between the US and China, and I think that's not something that's in China's interest. But you make an excellent point, Mick, about the use of coercion by China, and I think I think Xi Jinping doesn't want to fight a war if he can avoid it. I think the danger is he could be backed into a corner, say from the result of a Taiwanese declaration of independence or the United States leaning in too far on this flashpoint. But I think as long as he doesn't get pressured into initiating conflict, he's probably going to prefer to use those other methods of coercion. Where I see a big risk of conflict across the Taiwan Strait is through some miscalculation or some kind of inadvertent clash that escalates into something larger. And I think one of the things that differentiates this flashpoint from any of the others is the lack of any kind of crisis avoidance or crisis management mechanisms that are operating at present that could prevent that kind of inadvertent clash escalating into something much larger.
Yeah, it's, I guess for our listeners, the Taiwan's probably the most clearest example of a crisis slide that we have in this sort of topic area, and also in your book. Another point for listeners, there's also some great maps in this book, so make sure you check it out. Now, Brendan, we're going to crisis slide out of the Four Flashpoints because we have to go to the bill that you pay, apart from giving me a free book, which is quite cool. By the way, listeners, that's not a requirement for my guests to come on the show. They're just really, really nice people here at SDSC. But the actual payment is a definition that you will owe us. And it's a definition I extract from all guests, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, because war is such an important conversation for all societies to have. And if we can use other means of national power to avoid war, we will, much like some of the statesmen you mentioned are doing at the moment. So in defining war, in discussing war, we all need to weigh in and give a viewpoint. And your way of doing that is by finishing a sentence I ask every guest. So right now, I'm going to ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
And the way I'd finish that sentence, Mick, is to say war is avoidable. It's a very short answer, but what I mean by that is I think it's the job of a strategic studies scholar to think about ways to avoid war or to anticipate war in advance. I think it's one of the reasons why our field was set up to start off with at the very end of the Second World War, to avoid that kind of war on that scale ever happening again. And I think, one of the things I hope readers and listeners take away from this this book is the dangers of complacency and of thinking that we could never get back to that point again. So really, strategic study scholars often get a bad name for being, warmongers or bomb followers. But I think my intention in this book is really precisely the opposite to that, is to try to avoid war. So I think, in a nutshell, and in response to your question, I think war is avoidable would be my contribution to this debate.
That's a very original definition. We haven't had that one before. We've had the exact opposite before, so it's great to have counterpoints. I have to go through all the definitions and get some scholars and guests arguing about any definitions that are counter to each other. And listeners, you heard it here first, that strategic scholars are not fanboys and fangirls of war. Though I would like to put a caveat: if there's no war, what do they study? Maybe they study economic strategic theory or something like that. But that could be just as fun. My show probably wouldn't be just as fun. Now, Brendan, thank you very much for coming on the show and letting me into the building.
Yes, and thanks for having me, Mick, and congratulations on your wonderful podcast. It's an honour to be on here.
Oh, and I wish everyone would see it that way. So you heard him, listeners. It's an honour to be on here, even though Brendan's done 99% of the work for this episode to be produced, because all I do is turn up with a microphone and stick it in people's faces. Now, listeners, you can get this book through the show notes of Published, and that is the 4 Flashpoints, How Asia Goes to War. If you jump on our show notes, it'll take you to Book Depository. They'll do you a solid and give you free global shipping. That's not because of me, that's just because they're cool. And what'll happen is you'll buy the book. Brendan will get a bucket load of royalties, like I'm talking an obscene amount, and we'll get a little bit of tin if you buy it through our affiliation with Book Depository. The money doesn't come out of Brendan's pocket, it comes out of Book Depositories. So please jump on and buy it, and it will probably make its way onto the book list before this episode's released, because it's only 192 pages, so I'll probably be able to read it pretty quick smart in my coffee breaks at work. Don't tell my boss. And what else you can do to support Brendan? You can jump on Twitter and have a conversation with him. So you can find Brendan at Brendan K. Taylor. Now, for any other listener out there who's looking to study strategic studies, I have to plug the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre for 2 reasons. Recently, they hosted a talk I gave, and they did that completely out of the blue. And they also put me through a degree last year, and it was the best degree I think I could have hoped to have done in the field of military strategic and defence studies. So, listeners, jump on Twitter, jump on Book Depository, buy the book, sign up for a course at ANU, and until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.